Galere. I'd like to begin by welcoming everyone tuning into this discussion here this evening. My name is Michelle Gildernew. I'm the Sinn Féin MP for Fermanagh South Tyrone. This is a very timely and very important discussion. Within Sinn Féin, our team of MPs are especially tasked with engaging and motivating our Irish diaspora and supporters of Irish unity living across the water in Britain. As a group, we thought it was very important to have a discussion before the close of this year. Obviously, owing to the pandemic, we're unable to travel or physically meet as we'd like to, so we're going to embrace this new technology and move on and have probably roughly about a half an hour's conversation and discussion. Two brilliant contributors are with us here this evening. So first of all, my colleague John Finucane. John is the Sinn Féin MP for North Belfast. He's just finished his first full year as an elected MP and has had quite the year to cut his teeth. And then we have our very good friend John McDonnell. I've known John, oh God, in the region of coming up in 25 years, who has always been very kind and very good to me. So I'm absolutely delighted that John McDonnell has joined us this evening. John has represented the people of Hayes and Harlington since 1997 and has always been vocal in raising the issue of Ireland in the British Parliament and for advocating for dialogue and defence of the peace process. He's been a great friend to us over decades, and from 2015 to 2020 he served as Jeremy Corbyn's Shadow Chancellor of the Exchequer. So it's great to have friends in high places, and this discussion today comes as we note that we're now a century on from the Government of Ireland Act. The Act that first imposed partition on the Irish people. We felt that looking back on 100 years of a failed policy is a good jumping off point for considering how we begin the work of building a new United Ireland in the time ahead. And while people in the north of Ireland are planning for the celebration of the centenary, as a woman who's lived through half of it, a Tyrone Republican who's lived through half of those 100 years, I certainly don't think there's a pile to celebrate. So we're going to have a great discussion this evening. Again, thank you for tuning in and welcome all of you from wherever you are. And we're going to kick off and have a few words from the MP for North Belfast, John Finucane first. Over to you, John.
Thanks very much, Michelle. And it's a privilege to be involved in this discussion this evening. I always loved history. I actually did history with my law degree whenever I was at university, and I can't think of a more appropriate time. When a centenary in itself is a very significant event, but to have the centenary of the Government of Ireland Act, which we are days away from the 23rd of December, but to have the centenary in the political times that we are all living and breathing in at the minute, I think is one of those quirks in history that you get in so many different examples, particularly in Irish history, because you're saying that you've been a Republican, that you've lived for half a century. I don't believe that for a second, by the way, Michelle. You're being very modest there. But I think that I have never known a time whenever the conversation about the constitutional future is in the place where it is at present. We know that since the Brexit referendum of 2016, it has brought this conversation to a different level at a pace that is probably unparalleled. And I think as we pause and reflect, not just around the circumstances that gave birth to partition and the Government of Ireland Act, as we remember and recognise the lived experience for people, whether that was a positive lived experience if you were from one side of the community, or whether if it was from the majority of people that it was very much not a positive experience, which is a very glib way, I suppose, of describing partition for nationalists and Republicans. But as we recognise that with historical accuracy, I think it's vital that we use this point of time to look forward, to look to the future, to understand the previous 100 years, but also recognize that we are in a political place, we are in a civic place, we are in a societal place, not just in Belfast, where I'm talking to you from, not just in the north of Ireland, But Irish unity is now a global conversation. It's part of the conversation in America. It's part of the conversation across this island, whether people are for it, against it, or trying to decide exactly where their minds are. And it is very much part of the conversation in Britain as well. And I'm interested to hear John's thoughts tonight on the discussion, because again, I can't remember the constitutional future of this island being talked about from a British perspective, again, no matter where you fall on the question, the way in which it's been talked about, particularly since 2016. So, you know, yes, the significance of the Government of Ireland Act is huge. We still live with that, with the repercussions of that act today. The significance of the repeal of that act, which was brought about by the Good Friday Agreement, again, is significant, because that provides this island with the pathway to determining its own future. So I'm really enjoying the fact that we're having this conversation tonight, because this conversation is taking place tonight. It's going to take place tomorrow. It's taking place every single day, whether it's in people's family homes. Obviously, we have restrictions, so people aren't out socially as much, but the conversation is taking place. And I think it's going to gather pace even more as we enter into 2021. And in a way that has respectful discourse at its heart. We can have these conversations without necessarily trying to poke our political opponents in the eye, but have it in a way that responsibly looks towards the future and asks the questions, is there something better on offer? And I think that certainly as an Irish Republican, it's going to be no shock to anybody listening tonight that the Good Friday Agreement has laid before us a very easy and understandable pathway to a better future, and that is the triggering of a referendum, which I'm sure we'll talk about in a bit more detail later on.
Okay, thank you, John. I'm going to hand over now to the other John, to John McDonnell, for his thoughts and ideas, and to be part of this conversation as well. So, John, if we could have you now, Liddell.
Yeah, we're building consensus here, because I agree with John. You're never 50, Michelle. Don't give us that. Eh? Anyway. It's interesting, you know, I'm like John. In my first degree, I did recent history as well as part of it. And it's interesting, isn't it? Because just as an aside, there's on the BBC Sounds, they're doing the history of Ireland at the moment in, I think it's like 200 sections of half-hour programs. And it's quite interesting. Lots of stuff on it you can disagree with, but it's interesting that they're doing that, because it is stimulating a discussion. And just as a gentle aside, with regard to the anniversary we're discussing now, I find it absolutely fascinating. In the program, they discuss it, and they discuss the Lloyd George administration, and they discuss the settlements across Europe after the First World War under the Woodrow Wilson proposals. It's when Europe is coming out of a war, states are being established that maybe have not existed in those forms before. And one of Wilson's fundamental principles, which is, I think, deeply ironic, was that those states were going to be formed on the basis of plebiscites. So his principle is you ask the people what they want. And it's in this BBC Sounds programme, and I thought it was quite interesting because they also quote Balfour. And Balfour is the one in that government at the time who vetoed any possibility of asking the people of Ireland what their future would be. Now, we've got enough troubles with Balfour's historical legacy within Palestine, and it just shows he just didn't make mistakes with regard to Ireland. He did them elsewhere as well. He's left quite a damaging legacy. It's tragic, really. But I just thought it was quite ironic that this programme is on at the moment. It's quite interesting. But I agree with John. What the anniversary is like, that we sometimes get accused of living in the past or whatever. But I think more and more people, particularly young people now, are thinking, well, we need to know our history. Because actually knowing our history, you then know where you come from, what you're about. But also you learn from the past, you learn from mistakes, and you learn about how you want to go forward in the future. And that's what I'm finding stimulating, really. And a lot of this, John mentioned the debate that's going on across the globe. I actually think the debate is being fed now on a scale by young people that we've not seen for quite a long time on a whole range of issues, whether it's Black Lives Matter, which then took us into the history of slavery, etc. But also, interestingly enough, discussions amongst young people about the nature of the state, the community they live in, the policies that governments are pursuing, etc. And Ireland's come back on the agenda. Inevitably, it's come back on the agenda because of Brexit, that's the first thing, but also because of the implementation of the Good Friday Agreement. And I find it really interesting that people are beginning to learn about the cultural history of Ireland, about imperialism. Actually, for the first time, for a long time, there's a discussion within England, within the United Kingdom now, about the role of imperialism and Britain as an empire and what it did across the world. And Ireland's come onto the agenda. Of course it has, as part of that debate around imperialism. And in some ways as well, it's with the new generation that's come forward, it's looking back and saying, well, what mistakes were made and what responsibilities now do we have to help in resolving those mistakes? And I think that's why Ireland now has come onto the agenda so strongly with that. And as I say, I think it's just been a fascinating discussion. Almost from zero, people are educating themselves about the history of Ireland. Because, you know, people ask the question with me, why are you interested in Ireland? Well, with a name like McDonnell, you'd expect it because of the cultural background, of course, but also because for many of us living in England, our culture was denied. We never, you know, here's an aside, which you must probably find ridiculous, but actually, as a teenager, I can remember wanting to know about my background, where I came from, what my family. I was born in Liverpool, you know, some people think is the capital of Ireland, but there you are. But I was born in Liverpool, Irish generations, you know, Irish family. And then you learn, actually, there's all this Irish literature. And I was one of those people, this is pathetic, I know, but I used to go to libraries and I'd move Irish authors onto separate shelves and I'd put a sticker up saying Irish, because they were always done under English authors. I mean, I know it's a bit tiny thing, but for me, it always offended me because it was almost trying to wipe out the Irish culture. And then the more you learn, the more you then, that leads you on to say, well, how is this happening? And then for me, it was a real discussion about a learning about British imperialism. Now, we were never taught that. You know, we were always taught kings and queens and all the rest of it, never really taught about British imperialism. So you educate yourself to a certain extent. This new generation now is seizing hold of that education about British imperialism. And for me then, it was, you learn the history and then you realize, as someone who's, I have a fundamental belief in democracy. I think it's the best form of government we have. It can take us into cul-de-sacs at times, we know that, but at least it's better than any other form of government we've tried in the past. So you lead on, you culturally you get attracted to discovering your own history. Then you discover the concept of imperialism, the role of Britain in terms of an empire, and then its consequences. And the consequence for this anniversary is just the basic principle of denial of democracy, denial of the Irish people the right to determine their own future. And it is, you know, I blame Balfour for a lot, but if you look at that form of imperialism, it was one in which denying people the right to determine their own future, but also the other element of it, and this has occurred throughout empires, is the divide and rule element of rule of an empire like that. How you divide people up, and particularly under capitalism, how you divide working class people up as well. So this anniversary gives us the opportunity of riding that wave of interest in society by the new generation that's come through, and that wave of interest about history. That then leads us on, as I said, I think a lot of young people are looking back on that now and thinking, how do we overcome the mistakes and errors that were undertaken in the past, and how do we avoid them as well? And I think there's a real discussion going on about democracy and how people have the right to determine their own future at every level, whether it's regional government in England, whether it's the Scottish people deciding that they should have their own referendum themselves, and then also Ireland comes onto the agenda. And as I say, Brexit makes it even more critical as because of the decisions that are going to have to be taken now about the future of the Irish economy. And again, I don't think people can stand by and allow the Irish working class to be divided in the way they were historically in the past. And because at the end of the day, not only am I a Democrat, I'm a socialist. And the only way you can achieve any form of progression towards socialism is through class activity. And therefore, a united working class in Ireland, I think, is the only way in which you can really challenge the power of capital and the dominance of capital. So that's the sort of discussions that are going on. I find it remarkable because the discussions that are taking place here now are remarkably sophisticated in a way I think they may not have been in the past. But also, I think what young people have also brought to the debate is an empathy that maybe some of us lacked in the past. Maybe we didn't understand, didn't really fully understand or empathize in a way we should have done. This is a self-criticism of myself personally, but I think now there's a search for understanding, search for a way forward, but it's based upon those principles of democracy, but that element of empathy is there as well. So I'm now more optimistic than ever before that there's the opportunity now for me for that achievement of a united Ireland, because I think that's the way forward if you establish the principles of democracy and then you take people with you.
Okay, thank you, John. Very, very succinct and to the point, but very, I suppose, very timely, like I said earlier. And so interesting, you talked about Liverpool and being born in Liverpool, and the Liverpool accent is partly to do with the Irish influence in the city. And at one point, 1 in 5 people who lived in Liverpool were born on the island of Ireland. I think that's staggering. But it's a consequence of the famine and how our people were starved out of Ireland, either starved to death or starved out. And that genocide that happened, we're talking about 150 or 60 years ago, that people still remember the consequences of that. And we recently had a documentary, a 2-part documentary on RTE, and I think a lot of young people learned things then that they'd never been taught. Like you, we were taught about kings and queens. We weren't taught about the Easter Rising or the famine or imperialism or the history or the penal laws. I suppose the discrimination that was meted out to Irish people for over 800 years as a consequence of British colonialism. But if you take all that together and take it along with Brexit, and also I think we've been fed a lot of time a propaganda or a media agenda that we can't control. And I thought it was very interesting in, for example, and back to Liverpool, in the Brexit discussion, Liverpool was one of those cities that voted to remain within the EU, partly, I believe, to do with the fact that they don't buy the sun. And we've had a very right-wing media with its own agenda feeding us, drip feeding us for years, a parcel of or an agenda that they want us to believe. Now we've social media. Even within a pandemic, we have access to Zoom. We'll reach people tonight that we couldn't have reached if we were doing this in London Irish Centre. And a lot of young people have tuned in tonight. I'm delighted to see all of the people that have indicated that they're watching us. And I think, John, that we have the ability now to have that conversation and the freedom to have that conversation without instilling a Murdoch type agenda. So some of your thoughts just on all of that before going to the first question.
Well, just as an aside, on the issue of, you mentioned about the history of empire, etc. In the Black Lives Matters discussions, someone, in one of the discussions I was in, someone raised the fact that there's all these Irish names in the Caribbean. And actually there was an Irish youngster who got up and said, well, didn't you know we were some of the first slaves? We were, the Irish were sent into the Caribbean as slaves. And I thought that was really interesting in the way in which people then tuned in and made then the connection of the impact of imperialism. And that then led on to a discussion about the British economy. I convened all these groups around a group called Claim the Future, where we were looking at what sort of economy we want in the future. And one of the youngsters who worked in the City of London, who'd been one of my advisors for a while, he actually stopped the meeting and said, I don't think we can have any discussion about the future of British finance without talking about slavery and where that money came from in the first place. That then led on to the role of empire and its role in Ireland as well. The point that you made about the extraction of wealth, but also for Ireland, it was the extraction of agricultural goods at the cost of the Irish people themselves. So I think we're opening up that debate. I think you're right about Liverpool. Liverpool's actually was solidly remain on the basis that they can. Liverpool itself has almost declared UDI. You know, they've had enough politically about the way they've been treated over generations now. And they've said, we've had enough. We're not listening to this garbage anymore. With regard to the Sun, it was around the Hillsborough. But I also think it was a political reaction about how they've been treated throughout the 80s as well. And it's just interesting. And the forms of communication in Liverpool which enabled it to happen was social media to a certain extent, but it's also cultural too. And increasingly now, I just go to our own experience in the last election. We lost the last election on the Brexit issue, but largely because we never developed our own narrative. We had fantastic policies, but never put them together in one overall narrative. So interesting for me now is that the discussion with people about how do you develop a narrative, and then how do you use every mechanism for communicating with it. And again, it's learning from young people too, because part of the development of a narrative is, yes, using social media. In terms of the Labour Party, we reinvented the word of mouth as a form of political communication with all the mass meetings we were doing. But also a lot of young people are saying, actually, it is cultural as much as possible. And that is about performance arts, it's about music, etc. That brings people together and then brings them to the door before you can then get the message across them anyway. So at the moment, I think it is about making sure that we use every possible mechanism just to draw people's attention to the history of this anniversary. Is important to enable us to do that, but then also looking at the options and the issues that have to be confronted now. And as I say, in a way in which is done with empathy, understanding, in a way that you've been discussing with others as well, in a way that understanding why are people anxious about this issue at all, what makes them anxious, how can we overcome that, how can we take them into a safe discussion about it. And the Good Friday Agreement gives us permission to do that. It gives us permission to enable us to move on. But at the end of the day, also, we have to be honest with people. That then does have to be translated into democratic engagement. And that parts of that democratic engagement are the normal elections, of course, but actually it will come down eventually to the referendum about the future of Ireland. And again, what we've got to do now is create a climate of opinion which enables that to happen in an informed way, and a way in which I actually think it can be really inspirational for the future as well, where people can assert themselves as part of a community, set the agenda, the sort of society that they want to create, you know. It's that, I think it's that excitement that can be engendered now. But as I say, with that empathy, knew that some people will have reservations about even entering into the debate. So how do we ensure that happens? Part of that, and this is where the diaspora comes in really, part of that is holding that debate within England as almost as much as within Ireland. I don't want to exaggerate it, but it's quite important that the discussion is held here, because it's not just the discussion within the Irish community itself, it's in a much wider English community, so they can understand where people are going. Interesting enough, I think politics has moved on in the sense that I don't think anymore, even in the Tory party now, there is that sort of dyed in the wall, we're not budging at all. I think there's an element now about, well, you know, things will be decided by the Irish themselves. Of course, there's issues there about emotional attachments, etc., and the history of the Tory and Unionist Party. But it's not as wedded to those old historic commitments that they had in the way that they have in the past. I think, again, you've got a new generation of Tories that have been elected into Parliament, a new generation of Tories in mobilising, and they're trying to again demonstrate that they're a modern party. I still think they're Neanderthals politically, but nevertheless, I think they're trying to demonstrate they're open to ideas. I think we should exploit that.
Absolutely. Well, before, I suppose that leads us on nicely to our first question, and at the risk of sounding like we're having favoritism here, our first question is from Tony in Liverpool, and he has asked, under what circumstances could you see a British government initiate a referendum on Irish unity, and what should the criteria be? So John, a quick response from yourself, and then I bring John Finucane in. So the criteria for Irish unity and under what circumstances?
Okay, it depends on whether Tom is a Liverpool or Everton supporter, to be honest, this response, but there you are. I genuinely think the circumstances are the recognition that we're in different economic times, with Brexit now happening in some form, either by agreement or no deal. We'll see. The whole economic debate changes. That's the first thing. And I don't think, I honestly don't think that the same political stance that the Conservative governments have had in the past is holding. I think they have got an adhere. To give them their due, I think the Good Friday Agreement now is adhered to by all the political parties. So that gives us the opportunity then for governments then to say, well, let the Irish people themselves have this debate and let them come to their own conclusions. There's a much more relaxed atmosphere across the English political parties now, the UK political parties, than there's ever been before. So I think the combination of the impact of Brexit, different economic circumstances, a more relaxed political scenario across the political parties opens up a rational debate. If we can have a rational debate, I think there's a chance we could win it in both the debate, that's why the importance of the debate within England is so key, England and Wales and Scotland, where we can be raising these issues. And on that basis, you can see a British government just taking a standoff position and letting the Irish people decide themselves. And I think that would be, it's within our reach. And I'm not talking about decades off. I think it's within the next period of years as well.
Brilliant. John, do you want to comment on that?
Yeah, I suppose continuing the Liverpool theme, I was at a meeting a few days ago and Matt Carthy referred to Liverpool as the 33rd county. So I think never mind unifying the country, John, we're going to claim Liverpool as our own officially as well. I mean, this is the beauty of the Good Friday Agreement. We opened up tonight's discussion talking about how it repealed the Government of Ireland Act, and it set down the pathway as to what the triggering mechanism would be. And I suppose that the language of that triggering mechanism is now very firmly front and center in the political debate as to what will trigger the Secretary of State to announce the fact that there needs to be a referendum. And when you look at the potential indicators, there's an argument to say that they've already been met. So if we look at political indicators, we go back to the most recent Westminster election. For the first time in the history of the Northern state, unionism went back to Westminster in a minority. If we look at the elections, even in our last ever European elections here, we flipped 2 Brexiteers and 1 Remainer to 2 Remainers and 1 Brexiteer. If we look at the most recent Stormont election from March 2017, it ended the unionist majority in Stormont, and I think people accept that that's gone forever. If we look at the very crude, I wouldn't say that we are proponents of this, but if we look at crude census figures, then there is going to be a flip on that in the next couple of years. That doesn't, for obvious reasons, take for granted what way people would vote. And I think it's important, following on what John has said about reasoned and responsible discourse, is that I would not want to be part of any debate or discussion or campaign on unity where you simply wave a flag in somebody's face and demand that they vote a certain way accordingly. I think that the only positive that I draw from Brexit is that it's a how-to guide and how not to hold a referendum on constitutional reform. I don't want to unify Ireland through a referendum by painting a lie on the side of a bus or a double-decker bus or whatever, and I think that people need to be very clear about what it is they're voting for and what it is they're voting against. And I think that's why our position, that the recognition of the fact, not that we asked that the conversation should start, we're having the conversation tonight. Perversely, I know I'm jumping as an aside, perversely I attended a public debate in It was the McGill Summer School last year in 2019. And it was myself, Professor Pete Sherlow, and then TD Micheál Martin. And Micheál Martin spent the entire evening talking about how we should not have a discussion on Irish unity in an event that was titled A Discussion on Irish Unity. I mean, it defies all logic to deny that this conversation has taken place in all areas on all sections of society at all levels. So do we want to be responsible and manage change, or do we want to be reckless and invite chaotic change? And I think the answer should be obvious to those in government, both in Westminster and also in Dublin, that the change that is before our eyes is managed and dealt with responsibly. And I think that part of that needs to elevate this conversation, whereby the Irish government should be having a civic forum, because we do not, and I think we are always very clear to say this, Michelle, as you know, we don't own the debate. We are a significant voice in our own opinion within the debate, but it's not our debate. It doesn't belong to us. It belongs to everybody. And I think that even those who are opponents of it need to join and enter the debate. And I think that the centenary of partition, and I don't say this in any way triumphalist, but I watched the NIO launch of their program of events that they intend to roll out over the next 12 months. And I found it a really depressing, bizarre car crash of an event that before they even discussed what events they were going to be doing, they discussed legacy, they discussed Brexit, they discussed, I think the vision of it was very narrow and inward. And I think even those who wished to celebrate partition commented in similar fashion in print and social media. So I think that there's a question for those who would have an instinct to celebrate partition, where they are asking themselves the question, what exactly is it I am celebrating? Is it the fact that myself and my relatives had a good life and others didn't? Is that something that's worthy of celebration? Or is there now a real future in partition, or is there a different conversation to be had? And I mean, I know we've discussed this before, Michelle. I don't think political unionism is reflective of where those who identify as unionists are, because since Brexit, I have had many conversations, and I know certainly my colleagues are the same in the Sinn Féin MP team, where there are those who look to the future and see an England that is inward looking, that's very nationalistic, that has torn itself up over the Brexit vote since 2016, and they don't feel any identity or graph for that type of society. And they look to the South and they see a more prosperous, more progressive society. They value their European identity. That's not to say that the European project is perfection embodied, but they look at the undemocratic nature of all of that, and they feel, well, we want to have our say in our own constitutional future. And I think when you take all of that momentum, whether there's people going out of their way to find out what exactly their own history is and how it's brought them to here today, whether they're young or old or somewhere in the middle, or whether it's somebody who just realizes, well, I want to send my children to a university in the South, is that going to cost me more? Or we have an economy minister from Stormont, Diane Dodds, who last week openly accepted that the North is in competition with the South with regards to rivaling economies. We aren't big enough to sustain that, and it's one very easy go-to example as to the futility of partition and how there is no long-term, there's no longevity in this as a project. It simply doesn't make any sense. So I think the Good Friday Agreement provides us with that opportunity to decide our future ourselves. And I think what we need to do in the immediate term is secure the holding of a referendum, and then we need to go out and win it. And the reasoned discourse that is necessary in Ireland, I agree with John, it is as important that that discourse is of a similar nature within Britain as well.
Okay, thank you, John. We've loads of questions coming through, and we're sort of run out, as we always do, run out of time. I'm going to take the last two questions together. So far, Angela in London asked, what can political activists in Britain do to raise awareness about Irish unity? So I'm going to bring you in first on that, John, but you can also be thinking about then the next question that we're taking. Mark in London has asked, how would Irish unity be paid for? Is it really viable? So, so look, John, I'll let you go, if you would go first with the what can political activists do in Britain. And I have to say,
okay.
It's really heartening to see the people from all over Britain, Ireland, and further afield tuned into this tonight. It really, really is. So, John, over to you.
Shows you the interest, doesn't it, really? The key thing is to recognise the political climate that we're in within England, within the UK, okay? And it is one, after 10 years of austerity, after the COVID pandemic, that people are questioning the whole operation of the society we live in. Its economy, its political system, etc. And that's thrown up a whole series of discussions that have taken place, one of which is the constitutional status that we're in. So there is a discussion. There are constitutional conventions now being planned by the various political parties, by civil society as well, to talk about the nature of our government. And it ranges, I mentioned before, it ranges both in terms of the individual nations, whether it's Wales or Scotland, where the future is. It ranges into then federalism within the UK, within England, and then it ranges into local government, how it's financed, and even into the discussions around the electoral system, proportional representation. There is a ferment of debate. What we've got to do is make sure Ireland is inserted into that debate, because you cannot have a discussion about the constitution of the UK without then talking about the future of Ireland and the 6 counties. So I think for us now in England, what we've got to do is insert this issue into the debate on the basis of the Good Friday Agreement, of course. That's the first thing. The second thing is the point you made. There's a whole range of different mechanisms now in which people are having political discussions. So, for example, John mentioned the need for a forum. You know, now we're having citizens' assemblies on a whole range of issues, on the environmental issues and things like that. There will be citizens' assemblies around the constitutional issues as well. What we need to be doing is looking at how we start organising that debate through using every mechanism possible. The point that you made, raising issues through social media, mainstream media if we can, but we know what they're like. But at the same time, organisational forms like Citizens' Assembly. We now have a group called, Labour for Irish Unity. They came along with spokespeople to talk to the Socialist Campaign Group MPs this week, which are a really interesting discussion. It arose a whole range of questions about how we go forward on all of this. So now there's a ferment of activities that we need to really get involved in and recognise actually the time has come. It has come to have this debate, and let's have it and as open a way as we possibly can. I think whatever political party you're in the UK, should start raising the issue now and start linking up with others on a cross-party basis as well to see how we can put this on the agenda. Look at the organisational forms that we can throw up as part of this. And I just think the atmosphere is different now from what it was in the past. There's a willingness to have this discussion because, as I say, things have changed. The whole experience of the last 10 years, people are questioning our political system and how we organise ourselves, and this has got to be inserted in that debate.
Yeah, okay, John. Just then, before I bring John Finucane back in, your thoughts on how would Irish unity be paid for, and is it viable? And that's from Mark in London. So, as a former Shadow Chancellor of the Exchequer, it'd be interesting to hear your points on this.
Well, the issue is this. The thing about Irish unity, what does it do? It enables the Irish people to manage their whole economy rather than have a divided economy the way it is at the moment. That's the first thing. And the resources are there. Don't tell me that, they say this about other aspects of devolution in many ways. The resources are available, but they'll be democratically managed. It's as simple as that. And actually, what it does, it unites the working class in Ireland, who can then start raising the issues about equality, fair distribution of wealth and power within the island itself, and making sure that all the resources of the whole island are available for the benefit of everybody, rather than the unequal distribution of of wealth and power, but also the role, unfortunately, of British capital plays in Ireland as well. So it's not a matter of not being able to afford. The resources are there. It's just making sure that they come with proper democratic management, and that democratic management learns the lessons of Well, redistribution of wealth and power on the basis of democracy.
Brilliant. Okay, John, I'm going to ask you to take those questions in reverse. John Finucane, how would Irish unity be paid for, and what should political activists in Britain be doing?
I think it's self-praise is no praise, but I think it's a measure of the way we're approaching this as a party, that we are taking on the tough questions, because for years you get thrown at you, we can't afford it. The South our political opponents in the South will say we can't afford to take the North on. Those in the North say the South could never afford us, so therefore the conversation can't progress. We launched, I think within the past couple of weeks, the Economics on Irish Unity, and it's an evidence-based, well-resourced document. It's available on our website. Pierce Doherty, our finance spokesperson in the Dáil, launched it, and I've had some meetings with business sectors and leaders in response to that document to open up the conversation, which is already going on. And I think the myth of subvention is exposed. And even economists, I mean, Michelle, you were at the Good Friday Agreement Committee with me, where economists who were given evidence at that committee accepted that you're not going to have on a Sunday and on a Monday, it's night and day, and there's no process of transfer between the financial responsibilities of a British government onto an Irish government. And I think they accept that. But with regards what exactly is paid for and what would have to be paid for in the event of unity are two very different projects. And I think that whenever you look through the paper, and I would encourage people to do that, I suppose this slightly goes on to the second question with regards what can activists be doing. The popularization of this conversation can't be underestimated. It's not just a conversation that's whispered in Republican clubs and back alleyways, in places around Ireland. This is front and centre. So people should be taking on board our own literature, reading the other resources as well, because other economists have looked at this. David McWilliams regularly writes about the futility of partition in the Irish Times. We have the Hubner report, I think, from around 4 or 5 years ago, and that even predated the Brexit referendum. And Brexit, as we all know, there is no such thing as a good Brexit for the island of Ireland. And we called that out the day and hour that the referendum was passed. So I think people should be encouraging and increasing the conversation, especially within Britain. The party has its own website, I think, on Unity, which has a reference not just to our own documents, but also to external documents as well. And that's just the type of thing that should be used to motivate to do exactly what John had said. So whether it's mobilising and contacting your MP, finding out exactly what their position is, if it isn't as clear cut as the likes of John, having this conversation within your trade unions, within your Irish associations, your sporting organisations, because if and when this conversation increases to the next level, those, from a British public point of view, they need to be informed so that they don't have a media bombarding them with the same lies that was told in the build-up to and following on from the Brexit referendum. So there is plenty of literature there, which I think makes it very clear that the economics, I mean, and I'll say, I'm probably saying this to highlight my own ignorance as much as anything else, but not coming from an economic point of view. I mean, I was surprised at just how, this is maybe sort of simplifying it too much, but there is a very straightforward element to a lot of what can be achieved in the event of unity and the opportunities that do exist. And without sounding misty-eyed, I think it presents us with a very exciting opportunity, especially from an economic point of view. I talked about Diane Dodds, saying that there are two economies that are competing against each other on an island that is small as ours. That doesn't make any sense whatsoever. There's the ability to have a new green tourism, a green economy, making sure that our energy resources are used better. The health system is also something that has been come to the fore, especially throughout this year, where people are scratching their heads as to how you can have two competing responses to a global pandemic on the one island. So there are lots of different sectors by which this conversation is advancing, and I think that economics is at the heart of a lot of that. What struck me from some of the meetings that we had with those who are significant business owners and even representatives of business sectors is that when they were listening to what Pierce was saying, when they were listening to the analysis of our own documentation, they were saying, yes, look, we'll get the economics, and we don't think that's your big issue. This is about hearts and minds, which I find very surprising as somebody who grows up to be told, well, the South can never afford the North, nobody can ever afford the North. And even that in itself, if you accept that, isn't that an indictment of Northern society, that we can only exist on a handout, that we are that incapable of ever operating on our own basis, that the only way that we can exist at 6 counties is because we get a handout from a British government and we can't be trusted with our own economic powers? I mean, it's nonsense on so many different levels. So I know it probably went on a bit in responding to the 2 questions, but they're the questions that people will ask. And I would really encourage people to, educate yourselves, because the material is there, and the ability to counteract and, go back on the arguments against unity is there as well. And I think that informed, reasoned discussion is what is going to help advance this to the next stage, where the referendum is called, and as I said, then when the referendum is won.
Yeah, okay. Well, thank you. And Gormila Melgav Guler, John and John, both of you, for giving up your Sunday evening to spend it here with us. As usual, time has absolutely flown. I want to thank everybody for tuning in. I want to thank both of you for the time you've taken away from your families. I want to wish everybody watching here tonight, especially to John McDonnell and to your colleagues in the Labour Party, and Jeremy, and the people that we've known and worked with for years. Thank you so much for being given so generously of your time. We want to wish everybody a very merry, a very happy Christmas, a safe 2021. Nollaig Hannah Jeev. We hope that people are taking care of themselves and following the public health guidelines wherever in the world you live. And if this conversation has motivated you to get involved in the new year, and if you're based in Britain and interested in joining the campaign for a new United Ireland, please keep in touch and email londonoffice@sinnfein.ie to be added to our mailing list. We do want this isn't our issue. This isn't our issue. This isn't our debate. It belongs to everybody. We want to hear from you, and I think it's a very exciting time, depressing and frustrating at times, but a very exciting time to be involved in politics. So wishing you all a lovely Christmas, a safe and healthy 2021. Thanks for tuning in. God bless and take care.